What if the people meant to protect you believed the world was ending and that you no longer belonged in it? What if a mother looked at her own children and no longer saw who they were, but something else entirely? And what if, while the rest of the world went on as normal, 2 children vanished, without urgency, without alarms, without fear? In the fall of 2019, 2 children disappeared. There were no frantic emergency calls, no late-night searches, no public pleas from a desperate parent. Instead, there were weddings, beach photos, smiling selfies, and silence. This is not a story that begins with chaos. It begins with calm. The setting is Rexburg, Idaho, a quiet town surrounded by farmland, wide skies, and a sense of routine. A place where neighbors notice unfamiliar cars, where children ride bikes without fear, where life moves slowly, predictably. It is not the kind of place where people expect darkness to take root. And yet, this is where the story begins. At the heart of this case are 2 children. Tylee Ryan, 16 years old, independent, protective, mature beyond her age. Friends described her as sharp, sarcastic, and deeply loyal, especially to her younger brother. That brother was Joshua J.J. Vallow, 7 years old, energetic, loving, a child who laughed easily and hugged tightly. J.J. had special needs and required routine, care, and patience, things those closest to him knew very well. Together, Tylee and JJ were inseparable, and both depended on one person more than anyone else. Their mother, Lori Vallow, did not look like a villain. She was often described as vibrant, charismatic, confident. In family photos, she smiled brightly, a woman who appeared deeply involved in her children's lives. She spoke openly about faith, about spirituality, about purpose. To outsiders, Lori seemed devoted, a mother navigating life's challenges with resilience and belief. But belief, when left unchecked, can change. And in Lori's life, belief began to shift, slowly, quietly, into something more extreme. Then there was Chad Daybell, a soft-spoken man from Idaho, an author, a self-proclaimed spiritual teacher. Chad wrote books about religious visions and near-death experiences, stories that claimed the veil between life and death could be crossed. He spoke of prophecy, of hidden knowledge, of an approaching end of the world. To many, his ideas sounded unusual but harmless. To Lori Vallow, they sounded like truth. When Lori and Chad's paths crossed, something ignited. Their connection was immediate, intense. They shared a belief that the world was nearing its final days, that society was divided between light and dark, that some people were no longer who they appeared to be. This belief system, often referred to as a doomsday ideology, would soon become central to everything that followed. But at this point, no one was alarmed, because nothing looked wrong. From the outside, life continued as usual. Lori relocated with her children. New schools were discussed. New routines were mentioned. There were explanations for everything. Tylee was busy. JJ was being homeschooled. The children were safe. No one imagined they weren't. And that is what makes this story so unsettling. Because when the children vanished, no one noticed right away. There were moments, small ones, that, in hindsight, feel heavy. A missed phone call, a delayed response, an answer that didn't quite fit the question, but nothing that screamed danger, nothing that stopped the world. And so the days passed, then the weeks, and still, no Tylee, no JJ. What makes this case so chilling is not only the disappearance, it is the contrast. While questions quietly formed, while relatives began to worry, life, for Lori and Chad, appeared celebratory. There were trips, public appearances, smiles captured on camera. The absence of 2 children went unacknowledged, as if they had simply faded away. At some point, concern turned into something else, a realization that the problem wasn't where the children had gone. It was whether they had ever been meant to be found at all. Because in the belief system Lori and Chad embraced, some people were no longer considered human in the way others were. And once that line is crossed, once someone is redefined, anything can be justified. 2 children vanished. A mother refused to answer questions. A belief system quietly took precedence over reality. And the people meant to protect Tylee Ryan and Joshua J.J. Vallow were the last ones anyone suspected. But the truth was already moving closer. And when it finally surfaced, it would reveal a story far darker than anyone imagined.
How does a family unravel without anyone noticing? At what point does belief cross into danger? And when does silence become complicity? To understand how everything fell apart, we must begin long before anyone realized 2 children were missing, because this was not a single moment of violence. It was a slow progression, a series of decisions, each one making the next easier. Lori Vallow was born in 1973, raised in a household deeply rooted in religious faith. From a young age, faith was not just belief, it was identity. As an adult, Lori married multiple times, each relationship marked by intensity and instability. Friends and family later described her as charismatic, persuasive, and deeply confident in her spiritual convictions. But over time, those convictions began to change. By the mid to late 2010s, Lori's interest shifted toward apocalyptic ideology, teachings centered on the belief that the world was nearing its end. Not metaphorically, literally. She became increasingly focused on spiritual warfare, divine roles, and unseen forces influencing everyday life. And then, she met someone who reinforced everything she already believed. In 2018, Lori connected with Chad Daybell. Chad was an author living in Idaho, known in certain religious circles for his books about near-death experiences and prophecy. He claimed he had visions, that he could see beyond the physical world, that he could identify spiritual light and darkness in people. To many, Chad seemed unremarkable. To Lori, he was extraordinary. Their conversations quickly moved beyond friendship. They spoke about destiny, about past lives, about divine missions. According to later evidence, Chad told Lori they had been married in previous existences and would be again. The emotional bond was intense and dangerous. On July 11th, 2019, everything changed. That morning, Lori's 4th husband, Charles Vallow, arrived at her home in Chandler, Arizona. An argument followed. What happened next would ripple through the entire case. Charles Vallow was shot and killed by Alex Cox, Lori's brother. Alex claimed it was self-defense. Authorities initially accepted that explanation. No charges were filed. But those closest to Charles were uneasy. He had previously expressed fear for his safety. He had warned others that Lori was becoming unstable, that her beliefs were escalating. Those warnings went unheeded, and the case moved on. Within weeks of Charles Vallow's death, Lori made another decisive move. She packed up her life. She removed her children from their routines, and she relocated to Rexburg, Idaho, the same town where Chad Daybell lived. 16-year-old Tylee Ryan followed reluctantly. 7-year-old J.J. Vallow, who relied heavily on structure and care, was uprooted completely. The move was abrupt. There were no long-term plans communicated. No clear explanations offered to extended family. Just a new beginning, or so it appeared. In early September 2019, Lori, her children, and others took a trip to Yellowstone National Park. Photos from that trip would later become haunting, because it was the last confirmed time Tylee Ryan was seen alive. She would never return to school, never speak to friends again, never be heard from publicly. Weeks later, J.J. Vallow was last seen on September 23, 2019. The next day, he did not attend school. When school officials asked questions, they were told J.J. was being homeschooled. It was a lie, but at the time, it was accepted. Days passed, then weeks. No one reported the children missing. Relatives were reassured. Friends were given vague explanations. Authorities were never notified. Tylee was said to be busy. JJ was said to be safe. And no one pushed harder, because the person giving those answers was their mother. On October 19, 2019, another shocking event occurred. Tylee Daybell, Chad's wife of nearly 30 years, was found dead in her home. She was only 49 years old. Initially, her death was considered natural. No autopsy was performed at the time. Friends described Tammy as healthy, active, and devoted to her family. Her sudden death raised quiet questions, but no immediate investigation. And once again, life moved forward. Just 2 weeks after Tammy Daybell's death, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell were married. Not quietly, not in mourning, but publicly. The timing stunned family members. 2 children were unaccounted for. 2 spouses were dead. And yet, the couple celebrated. To outsiders, it felt wrong. To Lori and Chad, it felt destined. By the end of 2019, the pattern was impossible to ignore. 2 children had vanished without explanation. Charles Vallow was dead. Tammy Daybell was dead, and those closest to all of it were the same two people. Still, no missing person report had been filed. Still, no urgent search had begun. The world had not yet realized what was happening, but the truth was already set in motion. And soon, the questions no one had asked would demand answers. Because silence can only last so long, and when it finally broke, it would expose a story far darker than anyone was prepared for.
What finally makes silence impossible to ignore? How long can a lie survive before it collapses under its own weight? For months, 2 children were missing, and no one seemed to be looking, until one phone call changed everything. In November 2019, concern turned into alarm. Kay and Larry Woodcock, the grandparents of Joshua J.J. Vallow, had been trying to reach Lori for weeks. Their calls went unanswered. Their questions were met with vague reassurances. Their instincts told them something was wrong. JJ was a child who needed structure, care, and daily support. Silence was not normal, so they did what no one else had done. They called the police. Officers were dispatched to Lori Vallow's apartment in Rexburg, Idaho. They expected to see a child. They didn't. When asked where JJ was, Lori appeared calm. She told police JJ was staying with a friend. Officers followed up immediately. That friend denied everything. JJ had not been there. He had not been seen. And suddenly, Lori's story fell apart. As police attempted to clarify Lori's statements, something alarming happened. Lori vanished. By the next day, she was gone. Her apartment was empty. Her phone was unreachable. The woman who claimed to know exactly where her son was had disappeared herself. And now, what began as a welfare check had become a missing children case. Investigators soon tracked Lori's location. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't running through back roads. She was in Hawaii, with Chad Daybell. The two were living openly, walking beaches, smiling for photos, acting as if nothing was wrong. They refused to cooperate. They ignored questions. And to investigators, that silence spoke volumes. At this point, the case expanded rapidly. Local police were no longer alone. The FBI became involved. Child Protective Services stepped in. Search warrants were issued. Investigators began piecing together the timeline, and what they found was deeply disturbing. Phone records showed movement patterns that contradicted Lori's claims. Text messages revealed a belief system that described people as either light or dark. Some messages went further, referring to certain individuals as no longer themselves. To detectives, it sounded less like metaphor and more like justification. Then came the financial trail. After the children disappeared, benefits connected to them continued to be collected. Accounts remained active. Money continued to flow, even though the children were nowhere to be found. To investigators, this suggested something critical. This wasn't neglect. It was concealment. In February 2020, authorities made their next move. A judge issued a direct order. Lori Vallow was required to produce her children. Alive, safe, accounted for. The deadline came and passed. Lori did nothing. No explanation. No appearance. No children. With the court order ignored, law enforcement acted. Lori Vallow was arrested in Hawaii. She was charged with desertion and obstruction, not murder, not yet. But the message was clear. The system was no longer asking. It was demanding answers. As Lori sat in custody, investigators turned their attention elsewhere. To Chad Daybell, to his land in rural Idaho. A quiet property, wide open space, no obvious signs of disturbance. But investigators now had phone data, and it placed key individuals at Chad's property at critical moments. Moments that aligned with the children's disappearance. What they suspected, they now needed to confirm. On June 9th, 2020, law enforcement executed a search warrant on Chad Daybell's property. Officers spread out. Cadaver dogs were brought in. The ground was examined carefully. Then, alerts. Within hours, investigators uncovered what they feared most. Human remains. They belonged to Tylee Ryan and Joshua J.J. Vallow. They had been hidden. The search stopped. Chad Daybell was taken into custody. There was no longer any ambiguity, no misunderstanding, no hopeful outcome. The investigation had crossed its final threshold, from missing children to confirmed homicide. And with that discovery, the questions shifted again. Not where were the children, but why? And who had decided their lives were expendable? The answers would soon come, not from belief, but from evidence. And the story was about to enter its darkest chapter yet.
How does a belief become a weapon? At what point does faith stop guiding someone and start giving them permission? As investigators uncovered the truth about what happened to Tylee Ryan and Joshua J.J. Vallow, the focus narrowed quickly. Not to strangers, not to outsiders, but to the people closest to them. At the center of it all was Lori Vallow, a mother, a woman who once filled her social media with smiling family photos, beach days, holidays, laughter frozen in time. Now, she faced allegations of unimaginable betrayal. Investigators were no longer asking where her children were. They were asking why she never looked for them. And the answers pointed toward something far more disturbing than negligence. Those who knew Lori described her as confident, persuasive, and deeply spiritual. But over time, that spirituality evolved. According to prosecutors, Lori became consumed by extreme religious ideas, beliefs that divided people into categories of spiritual worth, light and dark. In this worldview, a person labeled dark was no longer who they appeared to be. They were seen as empty vessels, replaceable. This belief, prosecutors argued, was not abstract theology. It was functional. It allowed Lori to emotionally disconnect, even from her own children. Then there was Chad Daybell, a man who presented himself as a spiritual authority, an author who claimed he could see what others could not. Chad spoke of visions, of divine rankings, of secret knowledge revealed only to a chosen few. To investigators, Chad was not merely sharing ideas. He was shaping reality. According to court records, Chad told Lori that certain people in her life had turned dark, including her children. This labeling carried consequences, because once someone was no longer considered fully human, normal moral boundaries no longer applied. What made this case especially dangerous was not one unstable mind. It was two reinforcing each other. Prosecutors described a closed belief system, a loop where Lori and Chad validated one another's fears, prophecies, and justifications. No dissent, no grounding voices, no limits. Together, they constructed a world where devotion meant obedience, and obedience meant eliminating obstacles. Another figure loomed large in the shadows. Alex Cox, Lori's brother. Alex had already been involved in one death, the shooting of Charles Vallow. He was deeply loyal to Lori. According to investigators, Alex acted as an enforcer, someone willing to carry out actions others would not. But before he could ever be questioned fully, Alex Cox died in December 2019, officially from natural causes. His death left investigators with a critical gap. A key participant, silenced forever. Prosecutors argued the motive was not singular. It was layered. First, belief. A worldview that framed violence as spiritual necessity. Second, control. The removal of anyone who challenged authority or demanded care. And third, money. Financial records showed continued benefits connected to the children even after they were gone. Inconvenient lives paired with convenient outcomes. Together, belief and benefit formed a deadly incentive. What stood out most to investigators was the pattern. Not chaos, not impulsive violence, but repetition. Each person who died or disappeared had been labeled a problem. Each removal simplified the world Lori and Chad wanted to live in. This was not a single act of madness. It was a system. At the heart of all of it were two children. Tylee Ryan, a teenager who protected her brother. J.J. Vallow, a child who trusted the adults around him completely. They were not symbols. They were people. And in the belief system that consumed Lori and Chad, they were redefined. That redefinition made everything else possible. By the time investigators fully understood the scope of the belief system, it was too late to save the victims. But it was not too late for accountability. Evidence mounted. Stories unraveled. The spiritual justifications collapsed under scrutiny. And soon, the case would move from fields and phone records to courtrooms, where belief would no longer protect anyone. Two suspects, one belief system, multiple lives erased. The question now was not what they believed, but whether belief would be enough to escape justice. And as the courtroom doors opened, the world would finally hear what Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell had to say for themselves.
What happens when belief meets the rule of law? When prophecy collides with evidence? And when the people who once spoke of divine missions must finally answer to a jury of their peers? For Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, the courtroom would become the final battlefield, not between light and dark, but between fact and faith. By 2021, prosecutors were ready to move forward, but the case hit an unexpected delay. Mental health evaluations determined that Lori Vallow was temporarily unfit to stand trial. The ruling did not absolve her. It did not declare her innocent. It meant only one thing. She could not yet participate meaningfully in her own defense. Lori was committed for treatment. For months, the case stood still. Families waited. The public watched. And the victims' names faded briefly from headlines, but not from memory. Eventually, doctors ruled that Lori was competent. The legal process resumed, and when it did, it carried the full weight of everything investigators had uncovered. Prosecutors laid out a methodical case, not driven by emotion, but by evidence. They presented timelines, phone records, financial data, text messages filled with coded belief. They did not argue madness. They argued intent. In 2023, Lori Vallow stood trial. She faced multiple counts, including the murders of Tylee Ryan and Joshua J.J. Vallow and conspiracy related to the death of Tylee Daybell. Jurors heard how the children vanished, how explanations shifted, how silence followed. They learned how benefits continued after the children were gone, and they saw how belief was used, not as comfort, but as justification. Throughout the proceedings, Lori's demeanor drew attention. She showed little visible emotion, no public breakdown, no overt remorse, just stillness. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached its decision: guilty on all major counts. The verdict confirmed what the investigation had already revealed. This was not confusion. It was conspiracy, and the sentence followed swiftly. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. No release. No appeals to destiny. No escape. For Lori Vallow, the world she believed was ending continued without her. But the story did not end there, because Lori was not alone. Next came Chad Daybell. Unlike Lori, Chad chose to go to trial, and this time, the stakes were even higher. In 2024, prosecutors presented Chad Daybell as the architect, the man who shaped belief into instruction. They argued Chad used his claimed visions to manipulate, to label people as dark, to assign spiritual value, or lack of it. Jurors heard how Chad's property became central to the case, how evidence placed key moments there, and how his teachings gave moral cover to irreversible actions. This was not abstract theology. This was belief with consequences. Chad's defense attempted to cast doubt. They questioned intent. They challenged interpretations. They suggested coincidence. But the evidence told a consistent story, a pattern, a system, a series of choices that pointed in one direction. And belief, once exposed to scrutiny, lost its power. The jury deliberated, and when they returned, the decision was unmistakable. Guilty on all major charges. The sentencing phase followed, deliberate, solemn, final. The court cited the calculated nature of the crimes, the betrayal of trust, the manipulation of belief to justify harm. The sentence was the most severe available under the law: death. The verdicts marked the end of years of evasion. Years of silence, years of unanswered questions. For the families of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow, justice did not bring closure, but it brought truth. For the public, the case became a warning about extremism, about unchecked belief, about how ordinary appearances can conceal extraordinary danger. 2 trials, 2 verdicts, 2 very different sentences, but the same conclusion. Belief does not place anyone above the law. And even the most carefully constructed world of prophecy cannot survive contact with the truth. But even with justice served, some questions remain. And the echoes of this case would continue long after the courtroom doors closed. When the verdicts are read and the courtroom empties, when headlines fade and silence returns, what remains? Is justice ever truly complete? Or does it simply mark the moment when the questions change? Because even with convictions secured, this case refuses to rest. In the wake of the trials, the legal chapter closed. Lori Vallow would spend the rest of her life in prison. Chad Daybell would face the most severe punishment under the law. For the justice system, accountability had been achieved. But for the families, justice was only part of the story. There were no celebrations, no sense of victory, only the quiet weight of lives that could never be returned. As the dust settled, a different set of questions emerged. Questions with no easy answers. How did the warning signs go unnoticed for so long? Friends had raised concerns. Family members had voiced fears. Authorities had been involved, more than once. And yet, the system never fully connected the dots until it was too late. Could earlier intervention have saved lives? It's a question investigators and social services continue to wrestle with, not just in this case, but in countless others where belief, control, and isolation intersect. One of the most disturbing lessons of this case is how normal everything appeared. There were no compounds, no barricades, no obvious signs of radicalization. Instead, extremism hid behind polite conversations, religious language, and familiar routines. This was not chaos on the surface. It was calm, convincing, certain, and that made it far more dangerous. Authorities have since acknowledged that this case reshaped how they assess extremist belief systems, especially those embedded within everyday life. Faith, belief, and spirituality mean different things to different people. For millions, they provide comfort, structure, and hope. But this case exposed how belief can be weaponized, how language meant to uplift can be twisted into justification. Here, belief did not just influence decisions, it replaced morality. And when belief becomes immune to challenge, it can erase empathy entirely. At the center of all this, beyond court filings, theories, and trials, are two children. Tylee Ryan, 16 years old, protective, thoughtful, a teenager who stepped into responsibility far too early, especially for her younger brother. She was more than a name in a headline. She was a sister who cared deeply, a young woman with a future that should have unfolded slowly. And Joshua J.J. Vallow, 7 years old, joyful, curious, a child who loved life, laughter, and routine. J.J. trusted the world around him, especially the adults meant to protect him. That trust was broken, and it is their absence, not the notoriety of the case, that matters most. The impact of this case extended far beyond one family. It prompted changes in how missing children are classified, how welfare checks are escalated, how agencies communicate across state lines. It also ignited public conversations about mental health, belief systems, and accountability. Because this case did not exist in isolation, it exposed vulnerabilities and forced institutions to confront them. There is no ending here that feels complete, no conclusion that brings comfort, only clarity. Clarity about what happened, clarity about who was responsible, and clarity about how fragile safety can be, even in places that feel secure. This case reminds us that danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles, it reassures, it waits, and by the time the truth emerges, it may already be too late. Remember the names, not because of how they died, but because of how they lived. Tylee Ryan, Joshua J.J. Vallow. Their story reshaped investigations, challenged assumptions, and left a permanent mark on true crime history. But more importantly, it left a responsibility. To notice, to question, to speak up, even when something feels only slightly wrong. Because silence has consequences. If you found this case compelling and want to follow more real investigations, courtroom moments, and true crime breakdowns, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Your likes, comments, and turning on the notification bell help you stay updated whenever we release a new story. Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your perspective.